two things this morning. Firstly, the nomination of Jay Powell as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. And then I'll touch on the tax legislation which has been introduced into the US House of Representatives for providing corporate tax cuts. I went to a presentation given by Jay Powell in Chicago in January. I went together with another esteemed colleague who was previously a state president of the Economic Society. Jay Powell spoke on a panel of three, and I thought he was the third most impressive speaker. The person sitting beside me, my colleague, said, Jay Powell is like vanilla ice cream in a white bowl. There's nothing bad about it, but there's nothing remarkable either. What did strike me, though, about Powell is that I thought he was a good committee man rather than a great individual. I think there was an economist, J.K. Galbraith, who said these days there are no great men, only great committees. And the reason I thought he was a good committee man is that the presentation that he was doing was pretty much straight down the middle of the summary of economic projections that's provided by the quarterly statements of the Federal Reserve. And I've written those up from time to time. And talks about gradual tightenings in policy and moderate growth and all of those sorts of things. I think Jay Powell owes his nomination to the fact that President Trump thought that the position of chairman of the Federal Reserve was rather too important to give to an economist. And so what he's selected is somebody with a lawyer with corporate background. Jay Powell had important high-level positions both in Salomon Brothers and in Cargill. People who've served with him on the Federal Reserve say that he is a great consensus builder, which supports my impression of him as a good committee man. But he also has a enormous knowledge of corporate finance and the operations of the US capital market, which has provided enormous assistance to the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve in terms of tailoring its interaction with financial markets. My guess is that in terms of monetary policy, Jay Powell will pretty much accept what the consensus of the committee is, the consensus of the state presidents or the individual presidents of the Federal Reserve, plus the members of the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve, and his own real intervention in the operation of the Fed will be in terms of financial regulation. So what I think we'll get with Powell is more of the same. Well signalled moderate changes in monetary policy with significant improvements in the regulatory structure of the US financial market. US tax cut legislation was presented by the House of Representatives last night. Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, gave a rousing address. There's a whole lot of content in that presentation about the levels of individual tax cuts and changes in corporate tax cuts and changes of individual components of the legislation, which aren't really settled yet. We won't know until the legislation is passed first by the House of Representatives. There needs to be also legislation passed by the US Senate. And then my understanding is committees of representatives of the Senate and the House of Representatives meet in committee to finalise the legislation. But I think it's highly likely that the legislation will be passed, say, by March next year. The real impact on Australia, though, in the medium term is the change in the budget deficit. Now, what's interesting about the legislation, it's based on a pro forma budget that was passed by the US Senate and the House of Representatives, which includes an expansion of the US budget deficit over the next 10 years by $1.4 trillion. Now, $1.4 trillion sounds an awful lot of money, and it kind of is, because it's around about 3/4 of the Australian GDP, but in US terms, it's pretty small. And that only amounts to an increase in the US budget deficit of 0.701% of GDP. I was trying to work out what the effects of that might be on commodity prices in the Australian dollar this morning, and my first run at the numbers suggests it might lift the equilibrium level of the Aussie dollar from 75 cents to 78. So in short, not much, moderately expansive, but not enough to scare the horses.